So thank you very much. Really pleased to be here. What I'll be presenting is, so I was part of the earlier partnership preparation development grant. And we did some pilot studies. And so I'll just be presenting about a pilot study that we conducted. So I was working with Sanja Senthanar and Catherine Lapel. So, as many of us would have seen previously, Bill Morneau, early when the Liberal government came in, was warning us as Canadians that we're going to have to get used to precarious employment. And I guess it's true. It's growing. It's here. But it's a challenge. And one of the big challenges, of course, is, as we've been discussing all morning, is that a lot of our return to work policies and processes were developed with a different type of employment environment in mind. So in view of that, our pilot study was looking at the question of how do precariously employed injured workers access or fail to access workers' compensation and return to work after injury. And we also included employers. How do employers of precariously employed workers describe their work approaches? So this was the study. We were recruiting workers who were on limited term contracts, part-time, self-employed, or minimum wage. We included workers with or without workers' compensation claims. We also, like I mentioned, talked to employers who employed these types of workers. Recruitment was challenging. We actually had 72 workers who responded to our many different types of recruitment attempts. But of those, only 14 met our criteria that I just mentioned. And of those, we had people from temporary work agencies, definite term contracts, minimum wage, part-time, and some with both statuses. But basically, all of them were doing low-wage, low-skill work. And finding employers who want to talk to you about return to work and their own precariously employed workers is also a challenge. But thanks to Sanja's amazing ability to get people to talk to her, we managed to find 5 employers, and even just those 5 helped us to really think about some of the issues. And so we engaged in critical thematic analysis of these data, which basically means we're trying to really listen to people about what they're saying and also try to understand their own socio-political position. So, in our pilot study, we identified 3 particular areas of return to work policy implementation that were showing up in relation to precariously employed workers. And a lot of these are going to be similar to what you heard this morning. The first challenge is the extreme knowledge and power difference between the parties, we'll talk about. The second is the issue of attribution and unsteady employment. And the third is what we've heard already a lot about, is the issue of employment insecurity and workers' willingness to speak up, or ability to speak up. So, beginning with the power imbalance. So, in Ontario, legally, employers have a duty to accommodate all their employees. And one of the things that really came through was the knowledge difference and, of course, power difference between the parties. So employers who were hiring workers on these types of conditions, they were very strategic in what they were doing. They knew what they were doing. They were well informed, right? It wasn't by accident that they're hiring people in this way. Meanwhile, the workers were financially insecure. They're impaired, right? They'd had illnesses. They were inexpert at navigating employment and compensation systems. So you start to see these extreme differences. Looking at the employers and how they talked about managing their relationship with the WSIB in Ontario, and just thinking about it in contrast to workers who aren't used to working with WSIB. And so, for instance, we have Lucas from a temp agency. He says, you know, we're organized. We have everything up to date. Usually WSIB are on our side. We have a pretty good rapport with them, right? So they have this developed relationship. They really know what they're doing. An occupational health nurse at a mine talked about something similar. We have a great relationship with WSIB. If WSIB wants to send someone to the mine site, she says, tells them, we don't need anyone. And she said they never push and they never send anyone. So you can see the employers handling WSIB in a certain way. The employers were hiring workers, like I said. They were being strategic in how they hired. And when we sort of asked them about handling work injuries, they really didn't see the logic of accommodating workers who they had just hired for a particular task, right? So, for instance, Chaire again in the mine, they had a lot of self-employed contractors coming in, and I won't even get into the issue of misclassification because that could be at play there. But she said, you know, they have a specific contract to do a specific job. If they can't do it, we'll take someone else because it has to be done, right? So it's a very instrumental attitude to what they're doing. Again, this temp agency employer, he says, you know, clients are looking for the best of the best. If a worker comes and if they have a previous injury on their record, like I'm thinking from my business perspective, right? So that business perspective is what's at play in precarious employment. And we could see it again when a temp agency employer was talking about how she was screening out any workers who could pose problems on the health front. And she said, for instance, our application process, it asks about allergies and physical restrictions that we should take into consideration. So she's sounding like she's coming across like a caring person, right? And she said, but they actually fill all that out, and then in the interview process, we go over it again. And you're going to be blown away by the amount of people who say, well, there was that time I hurt my back. Well, red flag, you know what I mean, right? And so if you're a temporary person, you're getting screened over and over again by people like that who are very, very skilled at screening. So yeah, in contrast, workers in our study, in our sample, had poor understandings of their rights. So for instance, this guy, Scott, who, these are all pseudonyms, they're not real names, was hired to work in a banquet hall, which is very common with temp agency work. And he was injured, but he was told they couldn't assist me because it had been a contract where no staff had been listed on the invoice. So they had no records. And I was told I could be easily replaced. So you can start to see, what's this worker going to do, right? They don't know anymore either. They don't know that they can fight. They don't have the time and the resources to either, probably. In other cases, for instance, in Louise, she was a young worker when she was injured. She didn't know about workers' compensation, and I guess her employers were, you know, pretty safe in assuming that they didn't have to mention workers' compensation. So she was injured on the job, and she said, you know, the boss called her and said, oh, I heard you got hurt. I'm sorry to hear this. You've been great, but we're going to have to see if you're still a good fit given the needs of the job. And Louise, the injury had happened a couple of years before, and she was still suffering the effects of it. In interviews, when you conduct interviews with people, it provides them a chance to reflect, and sometimes they start thinking about things that they haven't really had a chance to think through before. And Shannon, who is a minimum wage worker, was reflecting in their interview with us that she felt her employer was actually trying to avoid a paper trail. She said they never wanted to do anything by email. Everything was not documented. It was always by phone. It's when they look back and they start thinking, things weren't going the way maybe they should. Seth as well, who was on a probationary contract with a large firm, he recalls telling the HR manager that he wanted to see his family doctor for this work injury, but the company didn't want him seeing his family doctor. They said, that's not going to look good. We wouldn't support this because you're going behind our back. So you can see this sort of persuasion that comes from employers to workers about how they should behave when they want to submit a claim. And when, so Seth's WSIB claim was denied, and he found, when he actually saw his file a little while later, he saw that there had actually been information put in that was very inaccurate about his activities. For instance, saying that he had been a professional athlete and that was why he was suffering from these conditions, and he had never actually done that. It was a very particular type of athlete. He had never done that ever. So this just sort of shows you some of the dynamics that we were uncovering. But some workers did manage to submit workers' compensation claims, and that were successful. So for instance, we have a case of a worker, Brenda. She was a retail worker. She had a poker in the eye, basically, you know, a really clear-cut injury, severe. And she wanted to put in a workers' compensation claim. So here's her, she's talking about it. I told my employer that the specialist told me I have an injury. Can you write a WSIB report? And he didn't want to do it. So she goes to see her family doctor, and he starts the process going with the medical report. She shows that to her boss, so he knows he has to sign do the claim, right? So the boss processes it. But then Brenda told us she starts getting really bad shifts. The atmosphere turns very cold in the workplace, and she quit, right? So basically there were reprisals. So that was the first topic. The second theme that came through was the issue of the unsteady employment and how it's difficult to attribute where you got your injury from if you keep moving from job to job. And so, for instance, in this case, a worker had one job where she was injured, but on the side she had a little home business walking dogs, a bit of extra income. And her manager knew that and used it to scare her. So she says, I submitted the claim to WSIB. I expressed my desire to return to accommodated work in the box office. And she said, well, we know you didn't injure yourself on the job. We know you were dog walking. And so that claim just sort of got dropped. Because she was afraid that someone was going to come in and arrest her for doing illegal business, dog walking. Another challenge we found when we had, for instance, seasonal workers, and what WSIB often wants is some sort of witness, proof that your injury really happened. And with seasonal workers, it can become very difficult, especially tree planters who are up north. So here was Alice. WSIB said they needed proof that where it actually happened. And she said, well, the only person who was there was my coworker, and he's gone back to South America. I don't have a contact number for him. So they said they would try to find a contact number, but she got a letter a week later basically saying she was denied. So challenges when you're in these types of jobs. The last topic is one that's been raised a lot already, is looking at return to work policy in the context of employment insecurity. Basically, you know, if workers know that if they start pushing for some of these things, they're going to find that they're not asked in the next day, right? Things will start going badly for them. But it was interesting with Shannon, the nursing temp agency worker, you can really hear the fear in her voice, and I thought that this quote was an interesting one because you can feel the emotion. She said, the family doctor wanted me to file a WSIB claim. That's one thing I really, really regret not doing because she has ongoing health problems. I didn't end up filling it out because I was in such fear about my company. I was worried they might come after me. I was worried they might fire me. I was worried they might give me less shifts. It was so much anxiety. I was just constantly fearful, so I didn't do anything. So it's helpful sometimes just to hear some of these quotes, to get into the feelings that people have. And the interesting thing is our employers, of course, were fully aware that workers are reluctant to speak up. But it's interesting because in the case of this temp agency worker, this reluctance of workers to speak up wasn't cast by the employer as like, you know, a power imbalance. It's cast by the employer as workers being dishonest, right? They're hiding their injuries that could be from previous employment. And so here's the employer saying, you know, I find too many guys try to mask their injuries, playing them off like they're not a big deal so they can get to work. We have one gentleman that's injured his hand 3 times. And honestly, most of the injuries he's had is not a result of the work he's doing. It's a previous injury that he keeps agitating, but he keeps insisting, obviously, that he's good to go to work. So you can understand the worker, they have an insecure income, they're just, you know, they just want to keep working and have money coming in. But it's interesting to see how the employer is looking at that same fear of speaking up from a different angle. So just to wrap up, 5 minutes early. Basically, yeah, so what I've tried to do from this pilot study, and a lot more research needs to be done, is to describe how some of the workers and the employers in our study were reflecting on implementation of return to work policy. We could see how workers really were not certain about their rights, and even if they knew what their rights were, it was very difficult to implement them. The key thing is the strategy of employers. Often when we're studying precariously employed workers, we want to keep interviewing workers all the time. I think we need to interview employers. We need to really show how employers think and act. I think that's really important for us to do, if you can manage to get to talk to them. And so basically, yeah, we just want to keep on mapping out some of these dimensions of work injury and keep moving forward, especially with low-skilled workers who are just so easily replaceable in our economy. Thank you.
Thank you.